It's lovely to see everybody so happy and excited to be here. The buzz in the room is palpable. And thank you also to those who are joining us online for this evening's special event. I'd like to begin in a good way by acknowledging that we're meeting today on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh people, and in particular the Musqueam. Green College has always been a place of learning for the Musqueam since many years before there was a university in this place. And those of us who have the privilege of working, of living, and of gathering on these grounds are very conscious of the gifts that we have by virtue of being uninvited visitors in this territory. And of the reciprocal obligations that entails. And that's one of the commitments that Green College makes, is to continue the hard and important work of reconciliation, in particular with our Musqueam hosts and with other Indigenous peoples across Canada. For those of you who I haven't had the opportunity yet to meet, my name is Emma Cunliffe. I'm the pretty new principal of Green College. Thank you. It's the first time I've actually gotten to say that. And it really is my very great pleasure to welcome you here for tonight's special event with Arnie Guha, the chair of our advisory board. And I'll introduce Arnie in a moment, but there's a few words that I did want to say first. To begin, this is my first official event as principal. It's lovely to have so many friends and former Greenies in attendance. And thank you so much for coming and welcome home. We're very conscious that many of you feel about Green College as I know Arnie and I do. It's been a very special place in the hearts of so many of you. We're also very conscious that Green College hasn't always been great at setting up opportunities for you to come back and spend time with us. And so one of my key priorities as principal will be to start an initiative. We are starting an initiative right here tonight to reintroduce society members to Green College, to welcome you back into the community. As time goes on, that will include opportunities to meet current resident members. We're hoping to build a mentoring program, and we're hoping that you'll support us in continuing to offer to the current generation of resident members the wonderful experience that you had yourselves as Greenies, and help us to pass that forward. So welcome and thank you for coming. I'd like to introduce to you Sarah Ng, who will be responsible for leading our society member initiative. And so you'll be hearing more from her in the upcoming months and years. And we're really thrilled that Sarah has joined our team. And as I say, you'll be seeing a lot more of her. Secondly, I'd like to acknowledge the presence today of Patricia Merivale, Professor Emerita of English at the University of British Columbia. Patricia has been a great friend of Green College since its inception. Her academic work focused on comparative literature with a particular interest in metaphysical detective stories. And if you haven't read her 1999 collection with Susan Elizabeth Sweeney, Detecting Texts, it showcases Patricia's beautiful writing, her sense of humour, and her contributions to her field. Patricia has been a long-time supporter of our academic programming in so many ways, an enthusiastic attender at dinner, going way back before the time when I was a resident member of Green College. More recently, having established the John Grace Memorial Fund in honour of her friend Dean John Grace, who helped to found Green College. And most recently, having given a very generous gift to the college. So I'm very proud to announce tonight that Patricia has established the Merivale Fund for Visiting Scholars in order to continue Green College's proud tradition of attracting the best interdisciplinary scholars for long visits to Green College, to live and work here in community with resident members, and so to inspire the next generation of scholars. This is a transformative gift for us. It will allow us to strengthen the college for years to come. And so, Patricia, thank you so much. We will have an official recognition event where Patricia insists that we throw champagne around.
And we shall.
But for now, we didn't want to let tonight pass without thanking you, Patricia, for the very many ways in which you support the work that we do here. Finally, it's my very great pleasure to welcome home Arnie Guha, the multidisciplinary creative behind Acid for Yuppies, which focuses on experiential artworks from illuminated light boxes and electric murals to psychedelics-inspired scarves and fine art prints. Guha's trippy works are complemented by an extensive body of minimalistic photography and portraiture. Dr. Guha is head of experience design and a partner at Phase 5 with a BA and an MA from Cambridge and a PhD from UBC, where he serves as the chair of our advisory board here at Green College. His doctoral dissertation explored user disorientation in hypertextual environments, but he's here today to talk about his artwork. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand over and welcome Arnie.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Emma, and thank you so much for having me here. Also, Professor Don Fisher, thank you ever so much. You facilitated the reason why those two pictures are here in this room, and I cannot thank you enough for your generosity. And of course, all of you, heavens, on a beautiful afternoon like this, the last thing anyone wants to do is sit in a room and listen to an artist go on about why they do what they do. It's very indulgent, and I feel very indulged by you, as I always have with Green College, at Green College. So thank you all for being here. And the other person I want to acknowledge is actually my agent, Amana, and the agency that represents me, Highness Global, Amana Minori, and Nigel Nolan, director at Highness Global, with whom I work very closely for exhibits and so on. This is the community that has helped me blossom into an artist. So thank you very much for being here. So what makes my art psychedelic? And as you know from the, I'm just going to get my clock out here so I don't ramble on and on and on. From the invitation itself, I've been making the claim of being a psychedelic artist and have been accepted at face value and at exhibits and so on and so forth. I get asked all kinds of questions. But what I wasn't asked until earlier this year was what actually makes your art psychedelic? And when this group of teenagers at the Interior Design Show asked me that question, I was actually just a little bit stumped. And I thought, well, I better really start thinking about this so I can prepare a good response. And I started writing a paper. And then I thought, you know, the best way to sharpen that paper and my argument is to have it tested at Green College, because your detector is pretty sharp. So I'm looking forward to what you think. But before I talk about why my art is psychedelic, very briefly, what is my art? A quick introduction. And by the way, the color that you're seeing there is not quite what I'm seeing on my screen. It's a little bit distorted, but this is the first time we're using this brand new system, and so forgive us. I believe it looks truer to the original if you're actually watching this on Zoom. But what I primarily do are light boxes. So my images are then printed on backlit film, and they're put in light boxes, and those light boxes I installed. There's one at the National Club, 3 at the National Club in Toronto. What do you see over there in the center? That's actually not a light box. That's Two Bloor West at Bloor and Young, a major building, and they licensed a bunch of my pictures for their large 15 by 20 foot screen. And I also work on architectural integration. So what you see over here on the right is from the brochure talking about the modern take on stained glass and printing that image on polycarbonate for a partition in a condo, if you will. Yes, the color's completely distorted here. I also do portrait photography. I do portraits and people. And most of my portraits are black and white. The black and white picture over there, the first one on the left, and then the third one are of another greenie, Ria Beaumont, who's a very accomplished Canadian concert pianist and composer. And I started doing psychedelic portrait photography as live, sort of photography as performance art, most recently at the Gardner Museum at the end of May, where I use my own psychedelic images. I set up a photo booth. I take pictures of people at the event, and those pictures are then projected in real time onto a large screen at the event. So the installation builds itself. The attendees are the installation, and it builds over the course of the evening. That's the second type I do. And I collaborate with designers. You're probably detecting a bit of a pattern here. It's not so much merchandising, although I suppose that is what it is, but I truly believe, and you'll see that carry through the talk today, I don't really believe in a finished work of art per se. I think everything constantly evolves, everything transmutates, and it isn't necessarily one state being better or worse than the other. It is simply different. So I rather love the idea of my images going out there in the world and then someone else doing something quite different with it. So what you see here are images from the Juma collection, Juma being a sustainable fashion house, the Canadian designer Alia Juma, who operates out of Dalian, China. The image on the left is from Shanghai Fashion Week last year in the fall. And the image on the right is actually a dress that is made, from the image that you see over on the wall right here installed at Green College. So that, in a nutshell, is my art practice. And I think you get a sense of I've been calling this psychedelic art and being accepted as a psychedelic artist. And why is that? Well, first of all, there is a recognizable aesthetic. So you see a picture, someone makes the claim psychedelic art, or someone mentions that, you're probably not entirely surprised. And to do a very quick refresher, if you will, the aesthetic, of course, as far as we are concerned, in our living memory, we think of the 1960s, and there are some very big names then. We have legendary psychedelic artists like Peter Max, like Singer, like Moscoso. What you see over there, the poster on the left, that's David Singer's poster for the last concert, or one of the last concerts at the Fillmore venue that he did for the promoter, Bill Graham. And what's interesting there is the lettering, the two elements, if you will, that one notices right away in any piece of what we intuitively accept as psychedelic art. There's one, the lettering, and the other, the absolutely brilliant, the bright colors. The lettering too, it's quite interesting there because initially Singer started out doing fairly illegible lettering, and then later on, by the time he created this poster, he was working with sacred geometry that was important for him, that people could read the names of the artists and then layer on any particular meaning. The middle poster is for a Chuck Berry concert. And this one, and the title's quite amazing, it's called Different Drummer. It's one of Peter Max's very famous pieces. Of course, has that resplendent color. It reminds one, if you will, of the style of the Yellow Submarine album cover. That's not Peter Max, but you can see that. And in an interview by Forbes magazine, he was asked, these colors, are they the result of your having done LSD? And he said, no, not at all. And this was his response. He said that his colors were actually inspired by a teacher he had as a child in Israel. They had to flee Germany, and the family actually went to China. And then at one point, they were in Israel, where he had an art teacher who was a folk painter. And this is very interesting here, what he says. What he was taught by his teacher to do was to see colors while painting where no colors seemed to exist. to the natural, to just looking at it. So he was taught to look at what he calls these quiet colors and to exaggerate at times to heighten people's perception. He talks about looking at the reflection of these colors on a white plate, on any surface. So again, when you look very closely, you start seeing these colors. And as he says over here in this quote, to heighten people's perception, to impart the gift of really seeing. Now, of course, when you think about it, and there's a personal observation, you know, when I grew up in Calcutta and then I went to Cambridge, and I spent some time when I was there at Cambridge, as happens to bookish people like us, all of us greenies, you end up in a place like that, you have access to things like manuscripts that you can actually look at. And I rather love chapels and churches, the architecture I really love, and the quiet. So I spent a lot of time in sort of quiet chapels, quiet churches, sitting there. The stained glass windows and these manuscripts, which of course are called illuminated manuscripts, and they use gold leaf, silver leaf, and so on. You see how they use a certain intensity, a certain luminosity, a certain, what someone might call an exaggeration, if you will, of color. Why do they do that? What happens when you sit in a church? Imagine, if you will, sitting in the church that had that medallion window. That's from the 13th century. There's no electricity. There's no Peter Max making posters, but you've come into the house of God, and the sunlight comes through, and it is completely transformed by these colors. And the colors themselves, when you look at the palette, and I don't want to go too far into this because I haven't done my scholarly research on this, it's personal observation, but what always strikes me is that it's the same or a very similar palette of primary colors. You've got the blues, you've got the reds, and it's the same sort of, there's a tonal similarity to the blues and to the reds, all the way from the 13th century down to what you see in the 1960s posters. So this idea of luminosity and color, which inspires a sense of transcendence, if you will. So what is it really, this idea of color, of light, and the mystical experience? Like everybody else, one of the world, and go to Aldous Huxley, of course. And what Huxley writes about, as we know, in Doors of Perception, he has this trip, the mescaline trip, and that he writes, as only Huxley can, very eloquently about not just his experience, which he does in a very detailed way, but he also examines his experience. And this is what he has to say about it. Oh, and the other thing to keep in mind about Huxley at this time is Huxley, Isherwood, they are at this time very involved in the Vedanta Society. Huxley is contributing articles to their journal on non-dualism, quite deeply influenced by this time by the teachings, the wisdom of Ramakrishna as propagated by Vivekananda. He has this trip, and this is what he writes, that the experiences encountered under the influence of any psychotropic substance, in this case, mescaline or deep hypnosis, are certainly strange, but he says that they're strange in a certain predictable way. You know how this is going to be. So what is that? He says that the common feature, first and foremost, is the experience of light. And then he goes on further to say that that light seems to shine from within, that whatever he's looking at, the object of his vision, seems to be brilliantly illuminated, but not from outside. It is shining from within. And he links it to Meister Eckhart, who, of course, was back again, we go way back at the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century, one of the key actors of the Devotio Moderna movement in Europe, the movement that went against the strictures of church and wanted to bring in the idea of a personal realization of God, the idea of that, a mystical realization, if you will. And Huxley says, uses the word ishtigkeit or isness. That's what he's reminded of when he experiences this. What's interesting for me is that someone like Huxley, and keep in mind, he comes from a family that is so scientific, connected to Darwin. There's just so much going on there, and Huxley doesn't ever shy away from science in other contexts, but he has given himself wholly to this experience. It is not that he denies that there is a rational explanation, a completely materialist explanation for this entire phenomenon, but to use that 60s tie, the saying that, you know, the trip is the medicine, Huxley is focusing here directly on the experience itself. So when I think of mysticism, and these are my words, not any great person's, what I always, the way I sort of frame it for myself, is when I can wholly accept a moment and the experience of that moment, when I can even luxuriate in that moment without thinking about that moment in relationship with or as a function of an infinite number of other events that caused it or adumbrated it. Now, we know in real life any particular moment happens because of any number of other things, but if you can extrapolate that moment and live in it, it can then yield wonders if you allow yourself to luxuriate within it. So that being said, what is my own psychedelic art project and how did this begin? Well, it began with an epiphany in the garden. The garden in question is a postage stamp garden in downtown Toronto and involved another greenie, my dear wife, Zoe. We complete 25 years at the end of this month, met right here. It was one Sunday in the summer, and Zoe was sitting in the garden and she was reading, and I took a picture on my phone, as you know, one does, and I rather like taking pictures of Zoe, but she doesn't know that I'm taking pictures of her. And when I looked at that picture, there was nothing, when I look at it today, there's nothing particularly special about that picture. I had what I can only describe as an epiphany. It wasn't so much a voice per se, but something that I felt, that I knew, which was, and I couldn't unhear it, you can walk 1,000,000 miles in the garden. Now, this came to me after a period of, my entire career, I've just traveled like a rocket all over the place, and this was a period of some quiet. This idea of walking 1,000,000 miles in the garden is not new. I mean, monks have been doing it forever. There's meditation walks and so on and so forth. But it was a sort of a quiet sense of knowledge, if you will, or conviction of something that Humphrey Osmond wrote to Huxley, my oldest Anne Maria, saying, you know, I knew that I knew, and I knew that others had known this before me. And it was at that moment what started happening were a few things. Photography, which is something that I used to do separately and often just black and white pictures. In my work, I've been using all manner of digital software for design. That's what my PhD was. I head up an experienced design practice. That's what I do. And all these different pieces of my life and all the various experiences that I had, the scholarly ones at universities like UBC, Cambridge, or Jodhpur University, the other ones, like I'm an old raver, raves I used to go to in England or Berlin and so on. They all seem to me as though they were, imagine if you will, you take out different objects from various drawers and cabinets in your house for spring cleaning, you put them out there. And for years you wondered what those pieces were. And then when you put them out on the table, you realize they all fit together. They were actually part of a puzzle that you'd completely forgotten about or perhaps never even quite remember seeing. But here they are, and that is sort of what you do. And what I decided to do very consciously at that moment was to embark on a Coleridgean experiment in willing suspension of disbelief. I live a rationalist materialist life. Like everybody else, I experience life. There's data points, I make sense of those data points, I make my decisions, and I live life accordingly. But what if you rearrange those points? We look at stars in the sky and we elect to see a bear, or we elect to see something else. What if you rearrange those? In fact, actually, the bear itself is pretty poetic, and if you will, a willing suspension of disbelief. So in Biographia Literaria, chapter 14, where Coleridge writes that famous line, before he quite gets there, at the beginning of the chapter, he's telling us about how the lyrical ballads came to be. And he's talking about his conversations with Wordsworth, of course. And what he says here is very interesting. The two cardinal points of poetry. One, the power of exciting the sympathy of the reader by faithful adherence to the truth of nature. You represent something exactly as it is. You strip away the ornamentation. That is what Wordsworth did. You stripped the language away of all the ornamentation, and you bring it down to exactly the way what Jarvis would later call common people would see it. And what Coleridge did was that second bit, which is the power of giving the interest of novelty by the modifying colors of imagination. What if you actually took what you saw and you changed it ever so slightly so that, and I'm going to read this a little bit, where he talks about the accidents of light and shade, which moonlight or sunset diffused over a known and familiar landscape appeared to represent the practical, I can neither see with my glasses nor without my glasses, the practicability of combining both, and this he calls the poetry of nature. And it's incredibly visual. If you read Coleridge, The Ancient Mariner, for instance, I mean, it's actually incredibly visual. So a Coleridgean experiment in willing suspension of disbelief, in trying to, if you will, cover both of these the facets of the poetry of nature. One is the truth of nature, and the other being the novelty, if you will, of nature that forces someone to truly take a look at it. And thus began my artwork, and I'm going to walk you through a few pieces, and I'll talk about each one of them. And hopefully give you also a sense of my technique and how it relates to some of the philosophical underpinnings of what I do. The first thing is about transmogrification, the absolute changing of one form or one thing into something quite different, or something that is perceived to be or experienced as something quite different. So I will take a picture, I'll take a photograph, and I often take photographs with a view to completely demolishing them, changing them completely. I take the photograph just for the palette. If you think about the history of art, there's two things that stand out. One is our relationship with perspective. I will not go into that. We learned how to deal with depth, and we flattened depth. And today in the world of virtual reality, there's 5 or 6 other dimensions that we are trying to get our head around. But the other is color. If you go back all the way from the Bisons of Altamira to Van Gogh to contemporary artists, artists always go out of their way to find the color that they need to use in their artwork. In the old days, it would have been natural dyes, pigments, blood, and then the mixing of those pigments. What I do is I simply take from nature. I take a photograph. In this case, I took a picture of a glass. That's the picture that you see on the left over there. It's a blue glass that we have in our house in Hudson outside of Montreal. I love drinking from the glass. On Mondays, I was drinking sort of, I suppose, against the sun. It looked fantastic. I wanted to take that picture. And then on the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I started working on what became this picture called Firebird. Now, Firebird, Ivan and the Firebird, is a Russian folktale. And it's not just Russian. I suppose Davor, did you grow up with that as well, Ivan, with the firebed? But it's certainly Russo-Ukrainian, and it is the story of a king who covets the feather of a firebed and sends Ivan out. It's a quest story, and in this case, what started out as a glass, I take a picture like that, and then I melt it. The way I melt it varies. It depends on what the picture is, what it is I'm trying to do. I might use a digital smudge brush in Photoshop to just create a chaotic pattern and then paint digitally from scratch. I might use distortion tools. There are multiple ways in which I do that. But however that happens, I start from a photograph that I completely demolish. I use the palette of it, and then I build something from it. In this case, there is a similarity, and there's a morphological similarity of shape as well, but that's actually quite accidental. Or is it? I don't know. But that's not what I was conscious of. It was the color that I was fairly conscious of. And then fiber transmogrification. The other aspect of this, because I design for light boxes, and I should have mentioned, I also do silk scarves. I design for silk. Luminosity is an inherent part of my work. Now in Photoshop, you can actually turn up the luminosity, but that's not what I do. What I use is layering. Photoshop, you work in layers, and you do that in order to keep different aspects of the picture separate and so on and so forth. Of course, I use it for all of that, but one of the things that I do is I use layers of the same picture, one on top of the other, and I work on the edges. It's a bit like grinding down the edge of something until it shines. So I use layering and the positioning of one layer of a picture against the other. And it takes forever to do in order to get to just the right kind of luminosity. So after I've got the basic picture, it goes into this phase. I go into a phase where I spend a lot of time layering in order to make sure that I've got just that right amount of luminosity where I want it to be, as well as ambiguity and depth. And one of the things I'm told by those who, by others who see my pictures is they get a sense of motion. And I ask them, are you in shrooms right now? They say, no, even when I look at your pictures, you know, it seems like they move. And I suspect that comes from a sense of, that comes from the layers, because the layers are often of the exact same picture that's ever so slightly been changed. This is a light box that's a part of the permanent installation of the National Club in Toronto. I call it Birchill Borealis. And it's a picture of a tree that my Coleridgean self considers a maternal presence in my life, a very, very powerful maternal presence, so much so that I spend every day under the tree. I meditate, I tell her my sorrows, I tell her my joys, and it all gets rather transformed into something quite beautiful. And I wanted to pay homage to my mother and her transformative power over me in this picture. And here's another example. This is a photograph that I did not demolish. I worked with the photograph. It's quite true, if you will, to the subject, but I used different layers of the same picture in order to get it to a place where I suddenly saw, staring me in the face, that moment of transcendence for me. Because one of the things that happens is, how do you know when a piece of when an artwork is done? I mean, I said just earlier on, it's never really done, but done for the time being, if you will. And so I keep doing it until, of course, you get that thump in the chest, that excitement when you not only recognize something you've seen before, but you feel recognized by the work itself. So this is Birchill Borealis again, and I wanted to do that. Full Moon Breakdown, Dupont Street subway station. Those of you who are from Toronto or have been to Toronto might know this particular station here. This picture, and I'm just going to hold the laptop up so you can get a sense of the true colors. They're much softer. They're a lot subtler than what you see there on the screen, and there's a lot more variation tonal within the colors over there. The TTC actually wrote to me and did use it when they started an Instagram campaign, and they were going to crowdsource some TTC pictures, and they said, can we use yours to inaugurate this campaign? And I was so honored, because Dupont Street subway station is one of my favorites, and I've got a whole series there. One's called Orpheus Descending. Every time I go down or I see someone go down those escalators, I'm always, for some reason, I still haven't figured out why, I think of Orpheus. Whoever thought that a subway stop could feel like a sacred space? But to me it does, and I suppose that goes to show that any space can really be a sacred space. One simply has to let it be that. Why do I call it Full Moon Breakdown? Well, the lights at Dupont Street subway station, as you can see over there, these big round lights that they've got that look like ship lights, the kinds that you see on ships. When under the influence, they really do look like moons. And breakdown, for two reasons. One, I listen to a lot of Appalachian music. I listen to a lot of music, and Appalachian's one of them. And of course, a breakdown in music is when you've got all these different instruments that are playing the same verse, either together or sequentially, as the case may be. But they all do it differently, and yet it all comes together. And the unity of it is this composite that's so much bigger than what any individual instrument could have done on its own. And the second bit was, on one very particularly bad day in my life, going through a lot of stuff, it was right there at that station that I just felt completely broken down. And in that moment of despair, if you will, I also felt that this was necessary to build myself up. And so Full Moon Breakdown, Dupont Street subway station, and that's my homage to that particular spot. I think the name of this picture, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, probably tells you a tiny bit about what may or may not have influenced me, but one of my obsessions, if you will, is proportionality and the little things. We walk over what we consider weeds. We walk over the tiniest flowers. We say things like, oh, she wouldn't hurt a fly, as though a fly is hurt. And yet, if I were the size of an ant on this particular table, this would be bigger than 4 city blocks to me. And in fact, I take myself so very seriously in this life, but from 30,000 feet up, it's all inconsequential. So perspective, positionality, and probability are the 3 Ps, if you will, that to me are that perception is a function of. So whatever it is I perceive is a function of those 3 Ps. So one of the things that I do is I photograph the tiniest of flowers. I love photographing flowers and leaves. And I love photographing dead flowers. Zoe is a marvelous gardener. And I love photographing not just the flowers in the garden as they are and the height of spring and summer, but at the end of the season when they're dead. In this particular case, in 2021, during COVID, and I was lying in the garden, and in that moment, I felt that I saw the birth, the climax, and the death of this one flower in that one moment. And again, if you will, I still don't have the vocabulary to quite express it, because it's, goodness, it's not a voice in the sky, it's not a voice in my head, but it's that sense of quiet knowing, but it's a very firm knowing, if you will, was everything always is. And that the birth, the death, the evolution, it is all there. We perceive it a certain way because we have to. And what I wanted to do with this particular picture, which again, surprise, uses layers as well as other distortion, was to try to capture that sense that my death and my full evolution exists within me at the moment of my birth. And at the moment of my death, that baby that I was, or every single thing that I've ever been, it is all always there. The oak is in the acorn, and the acorn is in the oak. and that never, ever changes. But what is constant is entropy. One of the books that has turned into a bit of a Bible for me since COVID, and I go back to it, is Carlo Rovelli's Order of Time. And Makoto's here, and I'm going to try to get some time with Makoto to help explain to me a few things. But Rovelli talks about entropy in terms of the dance of Shiva, and he's as much of a poet as he is, of course, he's one of the foremost physicists in his field. And it's this idea of the little things and entropy. So this was shown at an exhibit last year, and you have a flower that's this tiny, and then you see it in a light box that is this big, and it's in the middle of the village in Toronto against a window, and you're looking at it in the dark, and you're suddenly forced to confront something that you might have simply walked over. It all comes together, if you will, all of these, and some of the collages that I do, where I work with all these different pictures that I've taken, especially pictures of dead flowers. I think, nothing ever really dies. And the concept of waste is also quite alien to nature itself. I mean, to us, it is, and we waste. We waste because we extrapolate from nature, and we often synthesize from nature, and as such, if we therefore do not finish our consumption, or we misconsume, etc., that which is left behind has no place in nature. Shorthand landfill. But because it doesn't, we talk in terms of waste. But if an animal goes up and eats part of a plant and walks away from the rest, if a monkey eats half a banana, although I'm yet to meet a monkey that would eat half a banana, but tosses the rest, you wouldn't accuse the monkey of wasting the banana. Some other animal would eat it, or it would, what we call, rot. But the process of putrefaction itself is really a process of another organism finding life in this thing. And likewise, we might lose consciousness, but as far as anything and everything else is concerned, it simply keeps evolving. And so I work with a lot of these individual pictures that I take, and I then incorporate them into other compositions and collages. And this is one of them, and this is called Across the Universe. And it was I get into these ruts with songs, and this was the pools of sorrow, waves of joy, and music is a very big part of my process. I should have mentioned that when I photograph, especially when I do these live photography as performance art sessions, I put on my headphones and I just go into the zone, and that very much influences what the picture looks like. And in this case, I was listening to this particular song on a loop. The other part of layers, this is one picture where I wanted to make the layers very explicit. I was standing at a shopping mall car park in Laval, Quebec, really not the most romantic place on the planet. And I don't know if you've been to one of these places. I mean, I'm sure you have. If you have a car, you've been to it, and you live in North America. There is a mall out there, and when the mall shuts down, and these malls are off a highway somewhere, there's a certain loneliness that descends upon the place. If you're all alone, this is not your home. You don't have your family. The cars start leaving one by one. The sun starts setting. Those electric lights go up, start going, and there's something that happens there. And so what I decided to do was, if you look at the picture closely, it's not actually, I did take a picture of all the cars as they were, but then what I did was I extrapolated one car and one stand, and then I replicated that right through to create what the car park looked like with lots of cars. And here I wanted the layers to be explicit to the viewer, because what I felt there in my moment of despondency, the loneliness got to a place of almost despondency, if you will. And I was coming back from a dentist. That will do it. We have John Diggins here with us, talking of dentists. I wanted to create that sense of, if you look at the layers, perhaps they actually can take you somewhere. Perhaps the layers are more like portals, if you will. And that's a choice, an aesthetic choice, or a perceptual choice. The aesthetics come later, that we make. And So I wanted to create this idea of a layered experience, and that's from 2021. This is my most recent work from this year, and I'm literally right now emailing this absolutely wonderful gallery on Queen Street. I think we're doing a show in October around Nuit Blanche in Toronto, but I don't want to say too much because we're still sealing the deal, as it were. It's the Bodhisattva trilogy that brings together all of these different things that I've been talking about, the idea of transmutation of every element of one's experience, being able to morph into something else, the universe itself as a constantly changing, continually evolving collage. Every individual object, and I'll pause for a second here to say, if you look closely, think closely, there is no such thing as an individual object, because everything that's individual is infinitely divisible. So even the idea of a unit is, on the one hand, essential to perception and to living life, and on the other hand, a paradox, if you will. But everything is continually changing, and as it changes, it does so in relationship with everything else around it. So the universe is not just a collage, but a constantly evolving collage. And to me, that is the beauty of it. And when you look at these three pictures, the history of it is that the middle picture, the second one there, is the one that I actually did first, and you can, and then the third one was second. And then the first one was actually third, and I'll walk you through each of these briefly. So the first one, and I wanted to call them the turn on, tune and drop out, because as a psychedelic artist, as a psychonaut, and if you will, a seeker, I kind of wanted to reclaim that phrase from what it has come to be known as. So turn on, deadhead dancing. This picture itself is a collage. The face that comes from multiple layers, the various flowers. They were all pictures of flowers that were dead flowers, as it were. And there's an obvious pun on deadhead. I did not grow up in North America, but if I had, and no doubt I would have been a real deadhead. Yes, I listened to a lot of Garcia. And this was not conscious on my part, but later on, looking at this picture, which is Dionysian, and it actually reminded me of that iconic picture of Jim Morrison that you often see on the black and white photograph. I forget the name of the photographer, where he's sort of got his arms like that, and you see it from about here. But this is what Timothy Leary has to say about turn on, the first of the three steps, if you will. He says, turn on meant go within to activate your neural and genetic equipment, become sensitive to the many and various levels of consciousness and the specific triggers that engage them. He says drugs are one way to accomplish this end, and I can tell you from personal experience that breathing and breath work can give you as powerful a trip as any acid trip or any other psychedelic drug can give you. So turn on, tune in. The second piece in this trilogy I call Tattvamasi. Tattvamasi is Sanskrit, it's one of the Mahavakyas. And it's where the teacher, Uttalakharuni, is teaching his son about the nature of Brahma. And the student asks the teacher, how then should we treat others? And the teacher says, there is no other. Thou art that. Tattvamasi. That is what it means. It's non-dualist philosophy, and it is at the very heart of Vedantic thought. If you go back to what I was talking about in terms of Huxley and his very deep link to Vedantic philosophy. And Leary talks about tune in. He says, tune in meant interact harmoniously with the world around you. And the process of detachment from involuntary or unconscious commitments. And the third is drop out. Can any of you discern a pattern or a shape in this picture, or is it just abstract?
Looks like a man in a robe. Yeah.
Sorry?
A man or a person in a robe. That's what I
A
say.
person in a robe? Yeah. Absolutely, yes. Like what I saw was the meditating Buddha, the sort of what you see in Thailand and some of the statues where one does have Buddha statues in Mahayana Buddhism. And so I call it Om Mani Padme Hum, which is of course a central mantra that is practiced, that is used, invoked by Buddhists. And I won't even try to explain what it means because tomes have been written on it by much wiser and learned people than I am. But a sort of a literal translation or approximation of it would be, behold the jewel in the lotus. And the way I use it in my meditation is the jewel at that moment in time could be anything at all. It could be the clock, it could be a glass, or it could be a really beautiful flower. It could be anything at all. But it is in the beholding that, if you will, the dropping out of this world lies. And one of the most profound experiences I had in our Toronto home was sitting in the garden one summer. I fell into, one gets the lazy eye, and then it's, if you truly have nothing better to do, you give yourself into the lazy eye, you keep looking at whatever it is. And I was looking at this tiny patch of grass, and as I looked closely, I detected motion. And as I looked even more closely, I detected more motion. It was the subtle motion of the grass and the wind, and then the further motion through insects and so on. And in that moment, that is the jewel that I'm beholding and contemplating. And finally, this is the last of my pictures that I'll share with you. I only have two of these where I've had truly strange experiences that are sort of mind-blowing, if you will, and one hears about these things. If you go on YouTube, if you type in DMT experience dimethyltryptamine, one of the common things you see across, whether it's, it doesn't matter who's talking about it, talks about going over to the other side and feeling as though they've gone into another dimension, meeting other creatures, and so on and so forth. In my case, I have only had that experience, I was going to say until just before this weekend twice, but it's actually thrice now. And the first time that this happened to me, well, each of the times, one of the things that's very common to it is after I come out of it, and I want to tell Zoe every little thing that's happened to me. And I find that I cannot, because I simply lack the vocabulary to do so. I can't even understand sort of literally what had happened. I just have a sense of transformation and understanding of all sorts of things. But what happened to me in the first two cases was about a week after the experience, I was working on a picture. And in this case, I'd actually set out to work with pictures of flowers I'd taken in my neighbor's garden, and I was going to do a scarf, a design for a silk scarf called My Neighbor's Garden. And I fell into, well, all artists fall into a sort of a trance. You get into a flow state. And it's not just artists, mathematicians, scientists. You get into that place when you're writing a paper that you love, you're into it. You're conscious of what you're doing, so you're doing all the right technical things, but you're equally unconscious. You simply go through the motion. And as I did that, all of a sudden, staring me in the face was my experience. And if you, as I said, the colors are not quite true, but there's, you should be able to detect multiple faces in there. And what was even more striking was that about a month or so after that, I was reading Terence McKenna. And Terence McKenna talks about his DMT trip. And this is what he writes, which is exactly what this picture is. I mean, I almost thought, and I'm going to do this experiment. I'm gonna feed those lines into Stable Diffusion and see what image they generate. Because McKenna describes it as the self-transforming machine elf creatures speaking in a colored language, which condensed into rotating machines that were like Fabergé eggs, but crafted out of luminescent superconducting ceramics and liquid crystal gels. This is what I mean. I give into the moment, and a luxuriate in the moment simply extrapolated from everything else. I want to end where I suppose one really should have started, which is the promise of psychedelics and what Huxley called the minimum working hypothesis. The very word psychedelic has its roots in Canada, believe it or not. The person who coined the term, Humphrey Osmond, whose picture you see there on the right, a British doctor who found himself at the Weyburn Clinic in Saskatchewan, the psychiatric hospital, and that, in fact, has also its roots in the CCF and some of the earliest initiatives under our universal healthcare movement. And there is an academic in Saskatchewan right now, and I'm so glad she's doing this, is working on this. I think Canadians should know about this, the world should know about the role that this country has played in the field of psychedelia. Humphrey Osmond was the one who introduced Aldous Huxley to, I believe it was mescaline that he gave Huxley and a lot of notables at the time, and they became very close friends. And he was friends not just with Aldous, but with Maria and the children. And they wrote a lot of letters. There's a wonderful book of letters that I've been devouring. And they were looking for a name for these entheogenic substances. What would we call it? So in one of the letters, Huxley wrote, to make this trivial world sublime, take 0.5 gram of pheneretime, and pheneretime meaning soul revealing. Osmond said, yeah, well, I don't think that term's going to catch him, pheneretime. He wrote back to Huxley and he said, to fathom hell or soar angelic, take a pinch of psychedelic. And psychedelic, mind expanding. But what was also very interesting is this line that he wrote in a letter to Aldous and Maria Huxley, which helped me find the vocabulary for what it is I've been trying to explain to my wife, to my friends who care to listen, about how these shifts happen in the mind. Because, as I said, it's not a voice in the head. It's not, in English necessarily. It's this sense of I knew, and I knew that I knew, and I knew that others had known this before me. So what is it that Osmond knew? What is it that Huxley felt that he knew? What is it that all of these people who were true seekers thought that they knew? And the most beautiful expression of it, and I will end my talk with this, is with what Huxley published this in 1944 in the Perennial Philosophy, called the minimum working hypothesis. And this is what he has to say. For those of us who are not congenitally the members of any organized church, who have found that humanism and blue domism are not enough, who are not content to remain in the darkness of spiritual ignorance, the squalor of vice, or that other squalor of mere respectability, the minimum working hypothesis would seem to be about as follows: that there is a Godhead or ground, which is the unmanifested principle of all manifestation, that the ground is transcendent and immanent, that it is possible for human beings to love, know, and from virtually to become actually identified with the ground, that to achieve this unitive knowledge, to realize the supreme identity is the final end and purpose of human existence, that there is a law or dharma which must be obeyed, a Tao or way which must be followed, if we are to achieve that final end. Thank you for listening.